Today on Crooked Mustache, we have this, the Toyota RAV4, the #1 selling small crossover in North America, and I'm going to review it, as well as give you my thoughts on what it's been like to live with after 3 years of ownership. Stay tuned. Now, a quick overview. The Toyota RAV4 has been with us since 1994 when it was introduced as a new model, as a change away from Toyota's more sedated styling amongst the rest of its lineup. Back then, it was introduced with 3 versions: 5-door, similar to what we have today, as well as 2 2-door options. It was available as a hardtop and a soft top, similar to the Jeep Wrangler or the Isuzu Amigo in that sense. It was the year 2000 that saw the largest single change in the entire model's history, going from the cool, quirky, fun V to the family runaround we're more familiar with today, with more evolution than redesign since then. The most notable change in the vehicle's history has been the removal of the hatch-mounted spare, moving the spare tire to the inside, consequently reducing cargo space by a little. Speaking of the interior, let's head inside. Now, climbing inside, you're greeted by Toyota's comfortable yet generic steering wheel, and preferably, you guys should know me by now, I would have preferred having paddles. That was available on the SE trim, not the Limited. Ahead of you is Toyota's standard traditional dual gauge layout. It's got 2 clocks, one for your revs, one for your speed, bridged by the information center in the middle. Now, on the steering wheel, you've got all of your infotainment and cruise control controls, especially the auto guided cruise control for distance from the vehicle in front. Over here in the center console, or on the center console, you've got your infotainment center. This is your navigation, if it's included, and your audio package. Now, one of our biggest downfalls with this car is they chose to go with a matte screen, which I believe in combination with the angle that it sits, you'll notice that most cars today, like the Kia K5 that we reviewed just a few weeks ago, has a perfectly vertical infotainment screen, which helps eliminate this glare and makes it a lot easier to see. Also, they use a gloss screen, that's a different thing, but here they use a matte screen, and I believe it's a TFT touchscreen. When you have the infotainment on, such as navigation, audio controls, and everything works without an issue, awesome. The moment you put it in reverse, if there's any amount of sunlight, I find myself holding my hand over the screen to cast a shadow because otherwise I simply can't see it. It makes the rear view camera pretty much unusable. Down here you've got your basic AC controls on this weird knee pad. I'll explain my issue with that in regards to the passenger seat in a moment. Now here you've got your basic AC controls. You've got a knob for you and your temperature, a knob for your passenger's temperature, and 3 buttons to control where the air hitting you comes from, where it goes to, and how hard it blows. You've also got a button here that's what I believe is a particulate filter. At first I thought it was a button that shuts off the recirculate, but it actually works independent of the recirculate. That was interesting. And once again, we've got the off and AC buttons. It doesn't make sense. Why can't it just be one button? On day 1, it should be AC on, and that's an end of it. Except it's not an end of it, because right now it's in the 60s outside, and I can completely understand many of you that live in the north, anything above Orlando, Florida, that would actually want to turn it off in favor of having your heater on to stay a little bit toastier in the car. So I'll understand that. Now, below the convenient AC controls, you have some of the most inconvenient seat and sport mode controls I've ever seen in a vehicle. For example, in my seating position, for me to turn on the heated seats, I have to lean forward, and assuming that you haven't felt it out, you kind of have to look. Now, you get 2 options. Some give you 6. Here you get off, high, and low. Can't get simpler than that. You also get an eco mode and a sport mode. From my day-to-day driving, I've noticed that the car tends to sit itself in eco mode anyways, but apparently you can turn a more eco mode on. Sport mode does what you would expect, pretty much only affecting the transmission, holding the car to a higher rev point in each shift. It is really nice to have the sport button as an actual sport mode, especially in hilly terrain as in this area, because it keeps the car in the power band rather than letting it shift to the highest gear possible for fuel economy. More on that later. Below you, you've got a spot which I believe would have been a perfect place for a Qi charger, and then you've got storage galore. 2 cup holders down here with a separate pocket. Each door pocket has enough space to hold 2 water bottles on top of whatever other things you might stuff into your door pockets. You have an extra storage pocket up here, which is convenient for your passenger if they need to put their phone, as well as your glove box here. You have a power port up here, but you also have a second one down here, another 12-volt power port, as well as a USB connection here that actually connects into what I have to say, for being not first generation, but for being something on a very entry-level vehicle, Toyota's infotainment centers, as far as compatibility with iPhone, I'm not an Android user, but as far as compatibility with iPhone, works flawlessly. You're able to access all of your playlists, you're able to access all of your music by album, artist, song, what have you. It really does work a treat. Your center console is very comfortable regardless of the driver's size. You can slide it forward depending on where you're most comfortable. Now I will point out what I had mentioned before, the passenger seat. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's specific to Toyota or specific to this class and having it as the passenger side vehicle, this seat does not go as far back as the driver's seat does, and it doesn't have any height adjustment at all, which can leave people in my position. For example, I am several inches taller than my wife. When she's driving, I tend to look quite awkwardly high. As you can see right now, I have pretty good headspace. In the passenger seat, it's almost zero. If we go over even the slightest bump, I find myself hitting the ceiling with my head. And also another thing I should point out, remember I mentioned this gorgeous leather wrapped knee pad? Yeah, it really does become a knee pad, because if you're anything over 5'10", you will find your knees bumping into the seat unless you have it all the way back. And even then, it's only about 1 inch or 2 inches of knee space that you get. It does really concern me if you were ever involved in a crash. And now with that, onto the back seats, where the RAV4 actually does, in my opinion, shine. Now in the back seat is where, as I mentioned, this car really shines. Let me close up here. I've gone ahead, which I do in all my reviews, and left the driver's seat in the position that I was in it, just to give an idea how a large guy like me actually fits in here. And it's quite comfortable. Like I said, I'm a big dude, but this is an interesting thing. Now, I don't know if this is in all SUVs, but at least in the RAV4, you can sit bolt upright, or for a child seat if it needs to be mounted in this position, or you can recline like it's a chaise lounge and you're being driven around by your chauffeur. But it gets better than that. There we go. In here, you've got your standard armrest with 2 cup holders. You have 3 3-point seat belts. You could get 3 children back here, but as I mentioned before, I wouldn't go past 2 large adults. It's gonna get quite uncomfortable pretty quickly. The center seat belt actually attaches from just over my head right here, clipping into a separate point here next to me, and then into the bottom, into its actual buckle, which gives you a 3-point seat for the occupant in the center seat. Now, as I mentioned, in the front you have 2 power ports. In the back you only have 1. Remember, this is a 2017, and this was also the same on the 2018. You have a power port down here. Now, my biggest complaint of this car, given the fact that it is the #1 selling in its class, the CX-5 from Mazda and the CR-V from Honda both offer rear seat air conditioning. This isn't even an option on this car, which is unfortunate. Now, in addition to actually having any back adjustment for your passengers, if you fold the seats down, you do unleash a cavern of cargo space with 73 cubic feet total with the seats down. And even with the seats up, that number only drops to 38 cubic feet, the most in its class. So it does have to be said that is where the RAV4 wins. In terms of overall comfort, I would say the back seats are the more comfortable place to be in this car, given the fact that they recline and you have ample legroom. Now, a few things I would point out, as I mentioned, there's no rear seat air conditioning. I would like to see individual reading lights for the passengers back here. For example, if you have a child who wants to read a book, God forbid in this day and age, on a long road trip. And I would have preferred to see USB ports or some additional power ports. Having only one does limit your ability to really provide for the passengers back here. But I have to say that it's not a bad place to be. This is definitely more comfortable than some cars. Now, moving to the outside, let's take a look at the engine. What we have here is Toyota's 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, first introduced in the 2009 Camry and the 2010 Scion TC, RIP. Now, that engine produces 176 horsepower and 172 foot-pounds of torque. It's what you'd call adequate for a vehicle of this size. Now that engine is mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission with eco and sport modes selectable via buttons mounted in front of the shifter under the center console. Now, while the base model towing capacity is just 1,500 pounds, it is worth mentioning that when equipped with the Adventure package, that towing capacity shoots up to 3,500 pounds by way of a factory-mounted transmission cooler, as well as other upgrades to help beef up the RAV4's off-road ability. The Adventure package also adds a heated steering wheel and an 11-speaker Bose audio system. Now let's talk MPG. Rated fuel economy puts the car at between 22 in the city and 28 on the highway. Now when you couple that with a rated tank capacity of 15.9 gallons, your theoretical max should be around a 445 mile range. However, this is where our ownership comes in. Having owned the vehicle for 3 years, we've noticed that in day-to-day use, it's impossible to exceed 300 miles before you're looming in fear of the next trip to the pump. We wouldn't run the risk of actually going to zero. But on a recent road trip, our drive up here actually, even though we had an indicated 28 miles per gallon, we struggled for the car to go beyond 320 miles before we felt the need to stop for gas. Now, as I'll show in a clip now from when we actually stopped to put fuel, even with 35 miles of range left on the indicated odometer or the screen, that still puts us at about 350, 360 miles. And as I'll also show in this clip, even with 35 miles left on the range, the car only takes 11.3 gallons of fuel. So either the Toyota's indicated range on the dash is severely hampered by having a massive buffer of fuel that you can effectively not even know you have, or there's an issue with our tank which simply won't fill to the rated maximum. From what we can understand, we're figuring that either the tank is smaller than it says it is, or we're constantly running around with an extra 3 gallons of fuel we don't even know we have. Now, 2019 saw a much needed radical redesign of the RAV4 as well as a lot of the Toyota lineup, and look forward to our review of the 2020 RAV4 coming up in just a few weeks. Be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our future videos on that. So moving on to the one that we've actually driven for the past 3 years. This is the limited trim. Now limited, not limited platinum, which means it still has black plastic cladding around the outside. You do get these tasteful, if plain, 18-inch wheels wrapped in all-season tires. Personally, I think the wheels that are on the SE model are more eye-catching, give the car a nicer stance. As a benefit of the limited trim, you get keyless entry by way of the chrome-plated door handles, not the body color matched door handles of less distinguished trim levels. Backing out of an extremely steep grade. I'm sure this looks quite entertaining on the cameras. Alright, now remember I mentioned that this thing has adequate power. To give you an idea of just how adequate that is, this is us on the hill. I'm gonna take my foot off the brake. The car stays still. Actually, it's rolling back. Car's in drive. I'm gonna put my foot on the gas and it moves forward. So now let's go for that drive. So as I mentioned, this thing has 176 horsepower and just 172 pound-feet of torque. And you know what, for the average person, that's gonna be enough. To be totally honest, the average driver, when I say average, I mean person who walks in, says what's the best selling crossover, and they get pointed to the RAV4, they won't even notice it. As a matter of fact, I've actually told people, I'm like, you know, they made a V6 version in the model year before, and I get responses like, it doesn't need it, it's too much power. Driving this thing in any section where you're climbing uphill for a long period of time, you do notice the transmission's propensity to try and be in a higher gear. It tries to put you in a fuel efficient gear as soon as possible, and realistically, for driving anywhere other than flat ground in Florida, that is not preferable. And yes, I am having to accelerate just to stay ahead of the vehicle in front of me. And you saw there that when I leaned into the accelerator, I didn't hit it hard enough the first time for it to actually stay in a power gear. It tried to shift up. I don't know if it's coming well over the mics, but engine noise is it's really bad. I mean, if this was a nice V6 or a V8 or a V12, something like that, it would be nice to hear that engine note. But to hear this thing from inside the cabin, it sounds horrible. It's just a 4-pot. It's not the kind of thing that, you know, really makes you go, wow, I'm so glad I can hear the engine note on this thing. The road noise, the tire noise is terrible. It is borderline unacceptable. And we're only doing 40 miles an hour. And that is enough to produce wind noise around all of the door seams and the sunroof. I constantly found myself on our road trip checking to see if I had accidentally left a window open because the noise was that bad. In terms of driving in general, if you're driving in a straight line, I don't really notice this, but what I did notice, especially on these curvy and twisty roads, is you know that when the steering wheel is pointing straight, you know the wheels are pointing straight, but because you find yourself turning left and right so often, I found myself with less and less confidence on where the wheels were actually pointing, especially when some turns are very tight. The steering really is numb. I mean, right now we're in these back country roads. I mean, they're actually main roads in this area. I mean, it really does feel kind of like it's almost like a video game with no feedback. You can hear I'm having to force the engine to work harder, whereas if I were to put it in sport mode, it actually drops down a gear instantaneously, and if I put it into sport on the shifter, it drops down again. So the car knows the best place to be in for the terrain we're driving. It's just choosing to keep the RPMs as low as possible. So that's the 4th generation 2017 Toyota RAV4. Handling is numb, ride comfort is adequate at best, cabin noise on the highway is terrible. Anything above 60 miles an hour, you struggle to either listen to music or have a conversation. It's really unaddressable. Hopefully we see an improvement in the 2020. Speaking of that, I definitely think this platform deserves, at least as an option, more power. I can't believe that the 2019 and 2020 RAV4s at best have a four-cylinder engine. Even the hybrid, it needs more power. Aside from that, I can't even point out that the gas mileage is that good, because while this car is rated at having a tank of 16 gallons, at best we're seeing 12.5 usage if you take into account the miles left on the actual odometer when we fuel up. Fuel mileage is great in terms of actual miles per gallon. 28 on the highway at 65 to 75 depending on the speed limit. That is fantastic for a vehicle of this size, but you won't see that day-to-day on day-to-day driving, especially on the street. And I simply can't even give it a thumbs up in terms of total range because of that weird fuel capacity. And if you're concerned that this is a problem that we're only experiencing, just Google Toyota RAV4 fuel capacity issues, and apparently people are even having issues with the 5th generation because of a tank design. Moving on. For some reason, this vehicle still is the #1 selling car in America. And I say car specifically because thanks to the Forbes article, we know that after the F-Series pickup, the Chevy Silverado, and the Dodge Ram, this is the best-selling vehicle in America, which probably means people look at pickup trucks, decide they want something smaller, so they go for the best-selling crossover, which is the RAV4. Even though the CR-V is better on paper, and we're going to bring you a review of that as well pretty soon, for some reason this continues to be the best-selling vehicle in America, beating out the CR-V by 50,000 units in June of this year. As I said, this thing does tick all the boxes. Tons of cargo space in the back. It is the most in its class every year. You can't beat that. It offers tons of equipment, automatic cruise control. There is a 4-wheel drive version available. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have the Adventure package, this tiny little engine can actually tow quite a lot at 3,500 pounds. So I'll cut my rant short. And with that, I present to you the #1 selling car in North America. I'm Alfred, thanks for watching Crooked Mustache. We'll see you later. color matched. That was an interesting feature, and this is what allows you to effectively have